In the historic Kingdom of Fife, not far from Scotland's ancient capital, Dunfermline, sits the village of Crossford. With a history stretching back over 1,000 years, those who have called Crossford home have seen their village earn its reputation as one of Fife's most haunted locations, a hotspot of ghostly apparitions and unsolved mysteries. In the course of this short video, we'll investigate some of Crossford's most prominent ghosts, explore its history of witches and witch trials, recall its most mysterious death, and even visit a few of its most haunted locations. Crossford's most iconic site is the medieval castle of Pitfirrane. Having been a fortified position since as early as the 10th century, Pitfirrane was home to the Halkett family for 600 years until the line ended in 1951, allowing the estate to become a golf course and the castle to become the world's oldest clubhouse. The Halketts would produce great heroes and villains who bore witness to the most pivotal moments in Scotland's history, though it is another figure that captures the imagination of visitors to Pitfirrane, the Grey Lady Phantom. In his 1997 work, Pitfirrane House and its Policies, Ian Dewar interviewed a number of villagers to discuss their encounters with the Grey Lady. A particular amount of activity appears to centre around the old castle chapel, now the women's locker room. Several members interviewed by Dewar complained of finding the taps of the locker room sink running fiercely when no one was around, and on another occasion the taps having been mysteriously turned off when no one was around to have touched them. The most chilling account came from a member who walked into the locker room with her friend to find a figure standing on the far side of the room, just out of proper sight. Dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a grey tweed jacket and purple scarf, unsuited to golf, the woman was described as slender, with grey hair and sharp features. As the figure walked behind the lockers and out of sight, the two peered round, hoping to see a familiar face. Instead, they saw nothing. That moment, the member's friend felt a sudden icy chill pass by her. In his work, Ghosts of Fife, Richard Faulkner relays the accounts of several different people from 1970 who claim to have witnessed poltergeist activity at Pitfirrane, including finding doors left open. More mysteriously, castle windows were seen to have been lit up at night in rooms that were known to have no gas or electricity. Bizarrely, Dewar also found accounts in the 1990s when rooms were seen to have been lit up. One dark winter's night, the lights in the castle had all been switched off when a woman and her friend left to go home. However, as they went past the front of the castle, the rooms were lit up once more, including in the old castle chapel. A similar event occurred with a different set of witnesses in December of 1996, though on that occasion they did not return to investigate. There seems to be little consensus on who the Grey Lady actually is, though several accounts link her to the ruins of Pitfirrane stables. In The History of the Halkett Family of Pitfirrane, Duncan McNaughton suggests that the ruins also once housed the stable and estate workers of Pitfirrane. Some speculate that the Grey Lady died here, perhaps in a fire. As well as noting accounts of doors being left open in the castle, McNaughton draws particular attention to people witnessing a ghostly figure walking from the castle to the ruins at night. Indeed, Dewar himself records an account from 1992 when the then barkeep of the golf club, David McIntosh, was walking from his home in the village to the castle one autumn night. On approaching the castle, he saw a woman in a long grey coat making her way to the stables. Thinking she must be lost, David called out to her, only for the figure to vanish before his very eyes. Pitfirrane does not hold a monopoly on Crossford's spooky sites. Keavil House, not far from Pitfirrane, has its very own pet cemetery. A residence has stood at this spot since 1496, and after housing Admiralty staff from Rosyth Naval Base during the First World War, the property would become home to Henry Wade Stewart and his family. Over the following years, they would bury their pets at the cemetery, with the headstones dating from 1921 to 1947. In the east of the village is Logie House. From the period 1563 to 1727, Scotland entered a dark chapter in its history, pursuing one of the most relentless crusades against witchcraft in all Europe. Around 4,000 people would be tried as witches during this time, some 84% of whom were women. Perhaps 2,500 so-called witches would be executed as a consequence. In Scotland, those convicted of witchcraft would generally be burnt at the stake, though many, but by no means all, would be strangled beforehand. In the early 1600s, Logie was home to Thomas Wardlaw, who presided over the trials of around a dozen different women accused of witchcraft between 1623 and 1630. One such victim was Beatrix Thompson. Suspected of forming a demonic pact with the devil, she was accused by another so-called witch, Margaret Martin, of having brought her to a witch's sabbath, a hedonistic satanic ceremony where Martin was presented to the devil. In 1630, Wardlaw would join Sir Robert Halkett of Pitfirrane to preside over the trial of Elspeth Bladdersons. This trial would have grave implications for the Halkett family, bringing us to our next haunted site of Crossford, the Witch's Stone of Pitconnochie. The Witch's Stone, tragically blown up by a farmer in 1972, was an enormous and distinctive blue limestone boulder that sat on Pitconnochie Farm. The story of how this peculiar stone came to be in the village varies, but is roughly as follows. With Sir Robert having established himself as a threat, a local witch on the brink of exposure thought to win favour with him by gifting Sir Robert a cheese press. Wasting no time, the witch journeyed through the woods, past endless flowers and trees misshapen by long-forgotten winters, until she eventually reached the seashore. There she found a great stone. Raising her arms before it, with a terrific flash of light, the stone was transformed into a cheese press, which she would then use to bribe her soon-to-be saviour. As the sun escaped over the edge of the earth, the witch set off for Pitfirrane Castle to present her gift, but before she reached the estate, she was surprised to meet Sir Robert wandering homeward across a field. With warmth, the witch flattered her laird before offering Sir Robert the cheese press as a token of her loyalty. However, much to her astonishment, Sir Robert announced that he had been made aware of the witch's wicked acts, and that he would take the attempted bribe as evidence of her guilt, before he quickly dashed off homewards. Rushing fury consumed the witch, and as she lost control of her fate, so too did she lose control of her temper. She raised her hands before the cheese press once more, and with a great flash of light, transformed it back into a stone. She then grasped the stone in her apron and silently pursued Sir Robert with a relentless determination to crush him beneath it. The witch quickly drew near to Halkett, completely focused on her task, and as she caught her victim, she let out a scream so terrible that it froze Sir Robert in fear. Though as she prepared to raise the stone and deliver the fatal blow, the strings on her apron gave way, sending the stone in the direction of hell and planting it firmly into the hungry ground. Halkett made his escape as the witch's fate was sealed. When Sir Robert and his men arrived at the witch's cottage early the next morning, they found it quite abandoned, the witch having escaped into the darkness, never to be seen again. Crossford is also the setting for a number of other folktales. The Lore of Scotland, a guide to Scottish legends, references a tale from around the late 1500s concerning a phantom appearing to be newly risen from the grave that haunted the local villagers. Each night he circled the old elm tree, reciting the words, "Frae the old elm tree on the top of the knoll, a seed shall fall off where a tree shall grow, and a cradle it will make to rock the wee bairn, will conjure the ghost that haunts Pitfirrane." Eventually, a seed from the elm tree did produce another, and once it had grown mature enough, it was cut down and the village carpenter made a cradle. The child rocked in it would grow up to be wise and pious, later becoming a clergyman. It was then that the old carpenter told the man of the prophecy, inspiring him to take up his Bible and candle and go to confront the ghost. The ghost confessed to a murder he had committed while still alive, and told the man he could find the bones of his victim under the elm tree. When the bones were exhumed and given a proper Christian burial, the curse was lifted and the ghost was never seen again. Crossford was also home to a tree far more sinister than the old elm tree. On Pitfirrane Estate, local criminals would be hanged using the Doule Tree. It's unknown when the tree stopped being used for this purpose, though executions in Dunfermline continued up until 1732, when James Ramsay was found guilty of stealing 4 cows and a beehive from the gardens of Pitfirrane. Cattle rustling had been an issue at Pitfirrane for centuries, with earlier generations having to keep the estate cattle in the castle dungeons during the night. The tree itself survived until the 1930s, before eventually being blown down in a storm. Pitfirrane maintains many relics from its ancient past. One area particularly untouched by the modern age is the woods in the centre of the estate, which were once market gardens. The trees and ivy have now reclaimed much of this land and consumed the decaying remnants of this forgotten era. One final story to share is that of the mysterious death of George Halkett. George inherited Pitfirrane in 1573. Due to his living in a period of relative peace in Scotland's bloody history, George was inspired to radically reconstruct the house from a fortified castle into a baronial manor, more befitting of the late 16th century, removing the castle battlements and installing a new wing, cobbled turrets and a grand stone spiral staircase. George was also known to have included secret chambers and passageways in the castle renovations. In 1585, plague ravaged much of Scotland. The General Assembly of the Church of Scotland therefore elected to gather in the plague-free town of Dunfermline, where George Halkett was provost. However, George had been commanded by King James, who was in conflict with the church at the time, to seal the town and keep the General Assembly out, causing a great outcry from the church. 3 years later, in 1588, George mysteriously fell to his death from a window in Pitfirrane Castle. No one knows whether George was pushed or whether he cast himself out, perhaps wrapped with angst at the prospect of imminent assassination. Perhaps it was an accident. Figures at the time speculated that it was retribution from God. Whatever the cause, many say that the horrific death saw George forever condemned to haunt the castle that was once his home. On a final note, it would have been remiss of me to have made a documentary on the haunting of Crossford and not to have made an attempt myself to determine whether or not the Grey Lady does indeed exist. Returning to the ruined stables, I would use technology capable of identifying human shapes which had been used to discover ghosts. In the end, I could not find her. Perhaps she was haunting the castle that night. Perhaps she was too clever to be identified using modern technology. What is certain is that the village's long and tumultuous past has left its scars, and that this would not be the final word on the haunted sites of Crossford.